interview with Professor Bill Sullivan. Thank you so much. I do want to read on the back of his book. It says about the author. I couldn't word it any better. So it says William Bill Sullivan Jr. obtained his PhD in cell and molecular biology at the University of Pennsylvania and is now a Showalter professor at the Indiana University School of Medicine in Indianapolis, where he studies microbiology and genetics. He has published nearly 100 scientific papers and holds a patent for anti-parasitic drug discovery. Known among students as a funny t-shirt guy, Bill has earned multiple teaching awards for his lectures. Bill has been featured in Scientific American, on CNN Health, IFL Science, and The Naked Scientist, and Gen Con, and more. Through his writing, presentations, and interviews, he strives to make science accessible and entertaining for all. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much. And again, I'm always with the lovely Dr. Christine Henry.
Hello. Yes, thank you. I cannot say how much I love the book. The way you write is just so accessible, and I love all your little pop culture references throughout. It made me laugh, and I really hope I'm sure you're so busy with the research, but I hope you write another book because it was just so well written. Yeah, and what's interesting is I actually recommend your book to a lot of my clients because it really helps take the stigma out of dealing with mental health issues. And so many clients, it's just really kind of made them kind of take a sigh of relief to see, all these trauma things. That's not my fault, that there could be intergenerational trauma or ADHD or addiction issues. So I don't know if you realize that you've had that effect for so many people of giving them that broader context.
Yeah, well, first I want to thank both of you so much for having me on the program today. It's a real thrill to be here. I am truly honored by the comments that you're making about the book. And you kind of hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what I was going for with the kind of, yes, it's a legitimate science book, but to make it much more palatable, I put in plenty of pop culture references and news events that people can really relate to and latch on to. And that's kind of been one of my theories with respect to educating folks about some of these complex principles. And I think who doesn't want to learn more about themselves or how other people behave? So it's a great topic, and I'm glad both of you have embraced it and captured the message I was trying to send. And Christine, your point about trying to destigmatize some of these mental health issues, everything from obesity to addiction, and so on. That is probably the most rewarding experience that has come out of this book. I simply wanted to educate people about it, but I've had many people on shows and interviews or book signings come up and literally say how it changed their lives, which really was a tremendous surprise to me. To know that it had that kind of impact just made it all the more rewarding. So yeah, that's fantastic, and I'm so happy that you were able to capture that through reading the book. And thank you so much for recommending it.
Mm-hmm. No, I just seen, depression symptoms reduce just because that stigma is gone and they understand. So I work with a lot of neurodivergent individuals, ADHD, autism, and so some of that stuff, that's their brain and the way it's wired. And they have I'm lazy and all of these negative self-talk, right? But then you show them the science and the data, and they're usually very science and data people, as I think the three of us are, right? That then they can't refute that. And it's just this instant calm. So thank you so
that
much.
knowledge is tremendous power, and I think is the biggest step forward to getting on a healthier road. And by incorporating some of the other tips that people can find in the book or some of these other revelations that science is uncovering, that seems to be the most productive way forward in handling some of the major crises that we currently have. So it's wonderful, and I'm so glad it's being helpful to you and your patients.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so let's get into it. I cannot
Let's
wait.
Do it. Let's
okay,
do it.
So the first thing I wanted to ask, right, when we were discussing, or you were discussing viruses, you went into the Hershey and Chase experiment, and then you talked about phage, and then you talked about the study with it. And then I don't think it's fairly known that viruses in general are like it's an intracellular parasite. And with that, it has obviously different effects. It can affect people differently, I guess, because of, I guess from what you're saying is that bacteria that they potentially have. Now, with that, I don't know if I'm correct. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. But with that, as someone that's in the dog field, I automatically think, okay, obviously dogs and people have different bacteria in their gut, or they have different microbiomes. And because of that reason, to me, it makes sense that that's why dogs or animals have certain diseases that humans can't get. And that's why humans have diseases that dogs can't get, or animals. But at the same time, there are some potential similarities between bacteria to where maybe that's why there's some sort of zoonotic diseases as far as we can both get them from each other. So what do you think about that?
Right. So that's a lot. That's a lot of information to unpack. So
Sorry.
I'll start from the beginning and address. We'll ultimately get to the answer to that question, because it's a fascinating one and a very relevant one, given the pandemic that we've all been subjected to, which clearly was a zoonotic disease, a zoonotic transmission, meaning it hopped from animals into people.
Correct.
So it creates a lot of very fundamental questions along the lines, why do some viruses do this and others do not? Why do, even if the same virus gets into different people, why does it have a much harsher effect on one person and a very mild effect on another? All very good questions. But for the benefit of your listeners, let's make a distinction between viruses and bacteria. So the viruses are simply a tiny piece of nucleic acid. It can be DNA or RNA, and they encode viral proteins that basically build more viruses. But a virus can't do this on its own. It needs the machinery of a host cell. So it needs to get inside of some cell, and then it utilizes that machinery to make more viruses and then spread further. So it's a pretty helpless, parasite, if you will. It doesn't really do anything unless it's inside of an animal. And bacteria, there's all sorts of different species of bacteria, some of which are friendly and inhabit us naturally and do beneficial things for us. And then there's pathogenic bacteria that make animals or people sick. And those are obviously the strains of bacteria that we don't want in our body. But we don't want to broadly say that bacteria are bad or always linked with illness, because that's not the case. And in fact, as we'll go into later in the program, there's trillions of bacteria in our gut that we couldn't live without. So we need to, keep that distinction in mind. So with like zoonotic transmission, the first thing that comes to mind are usually viruses. Those are clearly pathogenic. I'm hard pressed to think of any virus that actually does good. They're usually bad because they get into the body and just start to wreak havoc. So why do they get into some animals and not others? That relates to the structure of the virus itself. This little piece of DNA or RNA is surrounded by a little bubble that is comprised of these lipids, these little fat molecules, and it kind of forms a membrane around the virus. And that membrane has a small assortment of proteins that are found in it. And those proteins will stick to the host cells that it invades. And they're very specific reactions. So a virus has a protein on its surface, on its coat, that allows it to gain entry into the host cell that it infects. And these are very specific, almost like lock and key mechanisms. So if it gets into one type of animal, one type of cell and one type of animal, it doesn't mean it's going to get into all types of cells in all animals. It's a really specific reaction. So we'll take the coronavirus, for example. It gains entry into its host proteins through this spike protein that probably everyone has heard about by now. This is a protein on the virus surface that allows it to unlock like endothelial cells and get inside. And it arose out of bats. Okay, the coronaviruses and bats have a long history together, and there's a lot of circulating coronavirus family members in bats. So they pretty much have been restricted to bats, but it turns out that in some cases, that spike protein not only works in bats, but also worked in people, okay, or at least some segment of the population. And that's just because the key happened to work in both places. And that's how the virus jumps from one species to the other. We've seen the same thing with like swine flu. This is an influenza virus that is quite distinct from a coronavirus, but the principle is the same. It infects pigs and can make them quite sick, but when humans come in proximity with that pig, the virus can jump from the pig into humans. The other component of the question I wanted to address was, why do some people get sick more than others? That also relates to the types of proteins they have on their cells. So sometimes that spike protein, going back to the coronavirus, it might work really well on some people, but other people have a different type of receptor on their cells through genetic variation, and that key doesn't work quite as well. So the efficiency of the infection is much lower in those people who are more or less immune to the virus. The virus just isn't getting inside very well. The second component to that question is the immune response. Some people have different immune responses than others. It's tempting to say some people have a better immune system than others, but that's a little inaccurate.
Of course.
It's different. Your immune system might be really good against battling coronavirus, but it might be really bad against some other virus. You really don't know. And someone who struggles against coronavirus may have an immune system that's really good at some other virus. That's what evolution does. It shuffles the deck the best that it can, creates as much variation within the population so that if a virus does leap from bats into humans, there's always going to be some fraction of the population who is better equipped to deal with it than others. That helps preserve the species.
And that's all based off of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and how much does gut bacteria play into all of that in immunity?
Yeah, great question. And that is still in its infancy. We're still learning about the gut microbe immune response axis, but there's clearly a component to it. And we see this in experiments that I think we might talk about later on, in that when we do these so-called microbial transplantations, so when we transfer intestinal bacteria from one individual, one animal into another, you can see differences in the immune response. Quick related experiment that came out just a year ago, there are some people who respond to cancer chemotherapy better than others. Okay, everyone knows that. So someone got the wild idea that maybe the microbiome is involved in this. So they took the intestinal bacteria from cancer patients who were responding well to the chemotherapy, put it into the patients who were not responding well, and they started responding much better to the chemotherapy. Wow. So this parallels the discussion with pathogens and the immune and the microbiome. There definitely does seem to be enough evidence to warrant further investigation that there's crosstalk between the microbes in our gut and the immune system. Of course, that's not the only thing going on. The immune system is dictated by genetics first. Okay, there's clearly genetic differences in our immune systems. There's differences in the immune system between men and women. And there's a microbiome component. There's also evidence that certain infections, certain viruses or parasites can fundamentally change your immune response. So they kind of like, after they infect you, they tweak it in a certain way, and then you respond differently to future infections. We've seen pathogens also seem to be the initiation point for a lot of autoimmune diseases. So some person might be perfectly happy, perfectly healthy, then they get sick, usually with some kind of intestinal infection.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden they get ulcerative colitis or something.
Mhm.
So we're just at the beginning of trying to connect all of these dots, but it's an excellent question and a very active frontier of research.
Mhm. And I know throughout the book, you know, in almost every chapter, you talk about uh, prebiotics, probiotics, and the effect on
And
mood. And if
real quick,
oh,
I
sorry.
had a question prior. So
Mhm.
with what you were saying, and just because I don't want to get off topic, and that all depends on the protein that that individual specifically has.
For like virus entry, is going back to that question.
Correct.
Yeah,
So, and that's when it
question.
comes to males, they have different proteins. Females have different proteins, and it all depends on how much they have to either based off the severity. That's what you're saying, right?
Well, they could. In terms of immune systems between men and women, that might be hormonally driven. So women
Okay.
tend to have a stronger immune system than men. So they tend to not
Wow.
get sick, or they're not down for the count as long. I know this from personal experience.
I was gonna
And
say that makes so
that's why
much
they're
sense.
like, yeah,
If I get
men are
a
babies. There's
if I
there's
get a
science behind it,
cold,
ladies.
I'm just like, I'm going to the basement. I'm binge watching some TV. Don't bother me. I'm going to need a week to recover. My wife, she gets a cold and it's like nothing. I'm like, what? I feel like such a wuss. But there's actually a lot of science to support that women have a stronger immune system.
Wow.
It's
Good.
probably related to the fact that they have different chromosome configurations. Men are a little shortchanged because we have a Y chromosome, which is not as doesn't have as many backup genes as another X chromosome does. Now there is a trade-off. Because of that more robust immune response in women, they tend to be more prone to autoimmune diseases because their immune system's a little
Oh,
hypercharged. So that
Interesting.
creates a predisposition for autoimmune disease. And that's why you
and,
see like lupus, for example, much more common in women than men.
Wow.
So there's trade-offs.
and I think autoimmune issues are such a hard thing to diagnose. I have so many clients who go doctor after doctor and they can't figure it out, or someone discovers they have Lyme, right? Have been exposed to that it's such a challenge.
It certainly is. It's not usually the first thing that comes to mind, but I agree with you. It should be on the radar much more often than it is.
Mhm.
Wow. All right, Dr. Henry, sorry, go ahead with your question.
Oh, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the difference of probiotics and prebiotics, because in reading the chapters, my thought is like, why aren't we all like, putting this, into our daily life? And I know you talked about the difficulties with, nutrition and changing diet as far as in the obesity chapter. So, even though good nutrition is like the ultimate way, that, there's all these reasons why that might be hard for people. But if you could take a minute and just talk about probiotics and prebiotics and maybe why it's not so easy. It is just grabbing a prebiotic off the shelf at Walgreens and
No, sure, Christine. That's a fantastic question. And I'm sure it's on the minds of anyone who's read the book, because the
yeah.
book talks extensively about the power of the microbiome. And there's many other books out there saying the same thing. So it's very tempting to come to the conclusion that maybe I should start popping some probiotics that claim to get me a healthy gut. In principle, I can certainly understand that compulsion, but there's some items there that give me pause, because what many people don't realize, which is kind of surprising, is that the probiotic market, just like vitamins and other supplements, is not regulated by the government. There's absolutely zero regulation. So the manufacturers of these products do not have to do any formal testing of their product, which means you can't be 100% sure that you're getting the bacteria that they are claiming. You can't be 100% sure of the colony forming units, which is basically the amount of bacteria. There's not been any clinical trials done on that particular product and the claims that they're making on the bottle. So consumers really need to keep that in mind before they start throwing a whole bunch of money at these companies for a product that they don't have to prove works. That would give me great hesitation before purchasing not just probiotics, but any product that makes a claim where they weren't required to prove it. Okay. If I'm going to give you a lot of money, I want to be shown the evidence that it works, and our government is not requiring that of these companies. So you need to keep that in mind. And if you want to pursue probiotics, I would talk to your physician about it, because there are some issues that may be related to drug interactions or other medical conditions. So you want to keep that in mind too. I generally just don't like to tell people to go buy stuff, even though it's on the shelf and over the counter and would imply that it's safe. Without regulation, they're not subject to safety trials either. So you simply don't, there's so many black boxes. You want to do this in conjunction with a consultation with a healthcare professional, your doctor, and he or she can probably recommend some of the more trusted names that might be out there in terms of which probiotics you should consider taking. So that's my precaution, my disclaimer about the probiotics. And there's also a lot of mixed science. So the clinical trials that have been done, some of these probiotic formulations seem to work. The effects are usually pretty modest, and some of them don't work at all. And this could be because they're different formulations, they're different doses. And by formulations, I mean different species of bacteria. You know, we have hundreds of different bacteria in our guts, and we have very few ideas on which ones do what and what products they're making that are conferring a certain effect. So there's just so many open questions that we don't know, that I think it's premature to just start medicating yourself with these products.
Did you say there was like 3 pounds of it in us or something?
3 pounds of bacteria in your gut, which is the same weight as your brain. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's why some scientists call the bacteria in your gut, the microbiome or the microbiota, your second brain, because it literally weighs the same. And as maybe we'll talk about some examples later on, as science is finding out, they do a lot of things that the brain might do. They make serotonin, for example. Actually, they make
90%
serotonin, which is crazy because that's a neurotransmitter that regulates mood in the brain. So I don't mean to jump ahead here because I know we'll get to those. I want to finish answering Christine's questions, because now that I raised all these questions about probiotics, I don't want people to despair. There's still very healthy ways that you can change your microbiome without that worry or without the questions that you're going to achieve a certain effect, and that's through prebiotics. For those who don't know, prebiotics are essentially what you eat to make probiotics naturally. So this is taking advantage of the natural processes in your body, but just eating the right foods. So what science knows so far about maintaining a healthy gut microbiome is eating a lot more plant-based material, primarily for the fiber. Okay, we can't digest fiber per se, but healthy bacteria do. And when they break fiber down, it makes these metabolites, these little products that line the gut and put up a protective barrier so that a lot of the toxins and junk that's in the gut that your body's eventually getting rid of don't leak out into the body. It's called leaky gut syndrome.
Yeah.
Sounds nasty. It is nasty because a lot of the molecules that leak out cause inflammation and other immune disorders. So you really don't want a leaky gut. If you eat a decent amount of fiber, the bacteria start to thrive and they build this protective wall that lines your intestine and keeps the waste in the intestines where it belongs. Okay, so fiber is really important, and it's in a lot of wonderful foods that taste delicious. People just don't normally go to them. So instead of the chocolate candy bar, eat a piece of fruit. You know, you'll satisfy your sweet tooth craving, but you'll get a lot of fiber. Other fermented vegetables also have been shown time and time again to confer a really good effect on the microbiome. And this is because they contain a lot of bacteria already, that a diverse assortment of bacteria, which can help propagate a healthy microbiome. So some of these products are like kimchi,
Oh, okay.
sauerkraut,
Mhm.
any of these fermented foods, pickles,
Hmm.
things like that. They contain bacteria species already
Hmm.
that once you get them inside your gut, if you continue eating that sort of diet, they're going to thrive and confer wonderful benefits on your health. So we were talking about serotonin a minute ago. One of the key things for that is to maintain a healthy microbiome. And one of the key products of a healthy microbiome is the diversity of bacteria. So the more diversified you are with, especially your fruits and vegetables, your nuts and your seeds, your fermented foods, you eat a lot more of those things, you're going to have a much healthier gut. And I would imagine your mental health is going to increase because of that. You're going to be much more mentally healthy because your neurotransmitters get thrown out of whack on the highly processed diets that are full of sugar, salt, and fat. Those kill the diversity of your microbiome, and that's going to destroy the chemicals that these healthy bacteria make for a normal, good state of mental health. So I don't mean to endanger Christine's line of work, but I believe a lot of people would benefit on a mental health level, would benefit from just incorporating a better diet and exercise into their lives.
Yeah.
It'll probably be better than any medicine we could currently prescribe. Unfortunately, mostly the Western way of life, our diet is just complete garbage, and we
Mhm.
don't exercise for the most part. We don't move around as much. So yeah, I'm not trying to like put credence behind the Paleolithic diet per se, but we do have to keep in mind that we've evolved over eons of time to be eating natural foods, natural ingredients. We have not evolved to eat these highly processed meals that we consume on a regular basis today. Our bodies just aren't designed to tolerate those, and we suffer mental and physical health issues because of it.
Now, I know someone, Beverly, commented about autism, and I work with a lot of autistic individuals. And in the book, I know you talk about the study with the um, the gut health and autism. And I was curious if you've gotten pushback kind of from autistic community. And I know you didn't say that it will cure autism or whatever, but early on, even with ADHD and red dyes and all these things, that parents were given that guidance that if you just alter their diet, that this will kind of cure the ADHD or cure the autism. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you've had anybody make comments on that for you.
And to piggyback on that, so I also have an autistic son, and he went through ABA therapy when I believe he was like 2, almost 3. And one of the things that they recommended was a probiotic. And whenever we put him on that, when I say it was a substantial difference, it was a substantial difference, to where that's when I really started learning about gut bacteria and the effects on everything that you're talking about. And it was truly wonderful. We had the absolute best results, and he ended up graduating a lot earlier. And now he's in public education. So just to piggyback off of that, I mean, I am a believer in that. So yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I haven't received any pushback. In fact, on the contrary, I've gotten a lot of good feedback because
Yeah.
prior to recent times, autistic children or kids that are on the spectrum, the parents shouldered a lot of that blame. They thought it was something that they did. They thought it was something or that they didn't do. They're so-called, like from the 50s and 60s, the
Hmm.
refrigerator moms, these
Yeah.
old moms who were accused of not giving their children enough love, and that's why they were on the spectrum, is not true. This is a biologically based issue. So I've received some praise or thanks for removing the blame, from these parents who were suffering already. They didn't need to go through this additional layer of suffering because there's no evidence to support that their parental behavior gave rise to the autism or putting their child on the spectrum somewhere. Now, Anthony, you raise an interesting point in that there's a spectrum, right? So there's going to be some children who are on the autism extreme end, and then others who just kind of have like shades of autism, if you will, or certain behaviors. And there could be some relief that comes from a probiotic. We certainly don't want to dismiss that. And if it's working for you, I say continue it, fantastic. Yeah. But there are documented studies that have been done in autistic children where probiotics don't do anything. So I don't want people to be misled that this is going to be a cure-all.
Fair point.
It's probably just not a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, I think that's the piece. I think that people, at least my clients and people in the autistic community, get concerned about, of like, it's a cure, right? I do agree that I'm sure that, better gut bacteria helps mental health for everybody, and maybe in particular, autistic folks or ADHD folks. But I think early on it was like, especially with ADHD, is like, remove red dye and, all these dyes, and then your kid won't be ADHD. And
right,
as you talk about in the book, like, there's so much neurology behind that proper diet does help, but doesn't cure. Yeah.
That's right. And that's exactly what some of these probiotic studies, a lot of them have actually focused on alleviating depression. And the ones that do work, it's usually a very small effect, but it's real, and it could be noticeable. So it's something that warrants further investigation. Don't want to write it off. And if it's working for you, great. No need to continue it. Like Christine says, it's just, we don't want to broadcast this message that if you do this one thing, it's probably going to make all the difference in the world. Because then someone goes and tries it and it doesn't work, and it just makes a bad situation worse. Autism is extraordinarily complex, and we don't know what's going on. We don't know the cause of this. What we do know is that there are genes associated with it. Okay, so there's probably a genetic component. Nothing we can do about that. There's probably a environmental component. And there's been all sorts of culprits identified, everything from the forever chemicals, the endocrine disruptors in the environment, the microbiome, bad diet.
And the hormones effects, like you talked about that in utero. Yeah.
I wanted to get into that next. Yeah.
And who knows, some of those might be right. Some of them might be wrong. It might be a cluster of things. I imagine the most sensible explanation is you have a certain genetic predisposition, you encounter something in the environment, and bam, that makes you the unlucky victim of this condition. And no one could have seen it coming because we don't have all the, we don't even know what the puzzle looks like, and we're still trying to put it together. But what I do know, the current state of the science, to the best of my understanding, is that, with this mix of genetic and environmental components, the brain gets wired in a different way. And
correct.
I'm not so sure. There's a really brief window in our development where the brain gets wired and neural pathways get set down. And there's probably, I don't want to say there's nothing we can do to change that later in life. I do think there's some flexibility there and some therapeutic techniques that can be really useful tools. But yeah, once that brain kind of solidifies and those neural pathways are in place, it seems to be pretty difficult to change.
Well,
not to say that we can't make some improvements, but it can be tough. It's
Well,
challenging.
and there's a statement that you say in there that I'm like, want to put it on my wall. It's like, work with the brain that you have
No,
and adapt your environment to that, instead of, because I think that's the struggle that so many of my like ADHD and autistic adults, is that they're trying to be neurotypical and that have their brain functioning in this way when it doesn't do that. So
Yeah, and with us being on that topic, you have a really amazing saying where, or I don't know if it's you or somebody else, I might be getting it mixed up, but they say genetics are the keys to the piano, and the environment is the song, and that's going into epigenetics, correct? So
yeah,
with that, as a canine behaviorist, I'm very big on the experience between that developmental phase, just for that reason. So one of the things I guess in dog training is whenever that dog's in that in that developmental phase, you got to make sure that the environment is just right, because obviously if not, that's when you can get really bad situations, or you can get aggressive behaviors. So I have a client, and when it comes to a genetic issue, there was a breeder. I'm not going to say what breeder, but as puppies, they had like a wire fence, right? Or it was like an electric fence, and to keep the puppies in, obviously they had the electricity on, and then whenever the puppy went to the gate, they got zapped. And then, as like how you talk about later on in the book, that experience created like kind of like a DNA scar or an environment scar. And then now every time that dog approaches a fence, or every time it hears another dog yelp, or every time that they have some sort of feelings, it creates a trigger, and that trigger creates a really bad outcome. Now, I remember that in the book you made this comparison. I mean, there's multiple studies in the book, everybody. You guys should definitely check it out. There is two experiences or experiments. One, you talk about mice with my clients, is like learned behavior. Yeah, exactly. So it is a learned behavior. Now, one of the experiments that you talked about was the twin mice, and the experiment and the different environment are how one mice had yellow hair and the other one didn't, or one mouse was obese, the other one wasn't. But then you were like, they're literally a replica of each other. Why is that? And sometimes it created an outcome. Sometimes there was something that was passed. And I thought it was really fascinating how, in regards to that aspect, you were saying in a pretty much like an area of famine, or whenever the baby's in the womb, when the baby's in the womb, pretty much it's already being
trained,
created to live in that environment. So when it's created to live in that environment, that's where you get them to where they eat food and their body naturally absorbs more calories, or they naturally absorb more bad nutrition, because they're already made to be like, hey, we don't know if we're going to get this again, so we got to do more. But nowadays, because of how bad the food is, or because of how accessible it is, that's where people get diabetes and obesity and so on and so forth. So that's when you did like the gut extraction. And so, I mean, I could talk about this all day, so I'm sorry if I'm going on a tangent, if I went into like 5 different things, but I think in that aspect, the epigenetic portion is so fascinating.
Yeah, and so it's great. I mean, it's such an exciting science. Go ahead, Christine.
Yeah, I was just saying it's so helpful with the intergenerational trauma for people to understand, right? Exactly what Anthony was talking about, how because of your grandmother's trauma that they went through, that the study you cited, right, didn't just affect the children, it affected the grandchildren, right? So like genetic change, fascinating.
Yeah, it would explain a lot of unexplained behavioral patterns that go through generations but don't seem to have the clearest genetic link in the world. So yeah, I think for the benefit of your listeners, Anthony, I can discuss what epigenetics is and how it works.
I would love that.
Yes. And then get into some of the transgenerational experiments that Christine's alluding to, because those are fascinating. But I'll say up front that those are highly controversial areas in the field of genetics. I think a lot of scientists are very resistant to the fact that something can be passed from one generation to the next that doesn't involve genes per se.
Well, especially motion based, right?
Motion or learned,
Yeah.
or dietary. It just, there's a dogma out there with Darwinian evolution, which is very difficult to challenge. Okay, I don't see it as a challenge to Darwinism. I see it as kind of a helpful corollary to it. And maybe after we explain, that'll make sense to some of the listeners. So what is epigenetics? The word literally means, when you break it down into its roots, beyond the gene. Okay, so everyone is probably familiar that genes are little segments of chromosomes that get passed down from parents into their children. You get 50% of your DNA from mom, 50% from dad. And those genes are basically the recipe, if you will, that build the creature. Okay, it's the genetic instructions that give rise to the individual, and it explains the differences between men, women, me, Anthony, all of our physical characteristics, and as we're finding out today, many of our personality and behaviors too have a genetic component. And that's not to say that they're 100% genes. There's a strong environmental component as well. But we can't dismiss the fact that we come kind of preloaded with these apps. We come preloaded with these genes that are going to predispose us into certain directions. So that's what genes do. They're very powerful. Like you said, Anthony, that phrase I like to say a lot. They're like the piano keys, okay? But they're not everything. The environment comes along and plays that piano, and there's many different environments. So even though you're born with a certain strict set of piano keys, there's lots of different songs that can be played. So the easiest example is, I would have been a very different person had I grown up in a war-torn, impoverished country, even though I had the same genes, right? It's obvious I would have been a very different person. I would have looked the same, maybe acted the same in some ways, but still at the end of the day would have been very different. So we can't underestimate the environmental component, despite the fact that the genes kind of predetermine our physical structure and some of our personality and behavior. So epigenetics describes how the environment changes the genes or tweaks them in certain ways. And that's why we say the environment plays the song. You can think of it in a different way. If you think of your DNA as the recipe of life, okay, the environment would be the chef. And different chefs are going to see that same recipe, but their food at the end of the day might come out a little different. Okay. And that's what environments do. Different environments can play with the same genetic blueprint, produce a modestly different individual as a result. How does this work? Well, we're just beginning to understand how, and we don't have time to go into all the weeds of like the molecular mechanisms of how epigenetics works. But one of the major changes is that, in contrast to like a genetic mutation, okay, which is another way that individuals can change, epigenetics does not change the sequence of DNA. It chemically modifies the structure of the DNA molecule itself. So we're not talking about a genetic sequence change. We're talking about a chemical modification in or near that gene, which changes its activity level. Okay. So DNA methylation, for example, this is a convoluted name for one of these chemical modifications that can be done to a gene. DNA methylation kind of are like those orange construction cones on the road. And the more DNA methylation you have on your gene, the less of it that's made. Okay. So you can now imagine, like, if you make a gene that predisposes you towards a certain behavior, okay, and all of a sudden that gene gets bombarded with all of these orange construction cones, you don't make as much of that gene, or maybe you don't make it at all anymore, okay? That's going to have an effect on the person's behavior at the end of the day. And that was not achieved through a genetic change. That was changed by something in the environment causing an alteration in these DNA methylation patterns. Quick example I'll give you. Scientists look at the DNA methylation patterns of identical twins when they're only 3 years old. And identical twins obviously are clones of one another. They have the same exact DNA, no genetic differences, right? When they look at the DNA methylation patterns in 3-year-old twins, they're virtually identical too. So the epigenetic marks are also very similar between young twins. We look at 50-year-old twins, again, the DNA sequence is the same, but the DNA methylation patterns are very different. And this is why sometimes in older identical twins, they can look and act differently than one another, which is a real puzzle. Okay, it was a mystery in the sciences for decades, because how can people with the same exact genes end up being slightly different or even physically different from one another? And it's because there's nuances in the environments they encounter which epigenetically change those genes and give rise to differences.
So what you're saying with DNA methylation is pretty much just a change in DNA sequence?
No, it's not a change in DNA sequence. The DNA sequence stays the same, okay? What happens is DNA methylation is like this little chemical structure that can be put on top that gene, okay, or placed in it. And it decreases the activity of that gene. Genes need to be turned on, off, okay? They're like a volume knob. They can be turned up or down. And the more the gene is active, the more it makes a certain protein, and that protein can have an effect on your biology. But if that
So is it a chemical change?
Yeah, it's like a chemical change on the DNA molecule itself, but it's not a change in the DNA sequence. And this is where the controversy comes in, because DNA sequences are heritable, okay? You get that DNA recipe from your mom and dad. That's unquestionably inheritable. That's Darwinism, okay? Some scientists claim that the DNA methylation marks that accumulate on certain genes can also be inherited. And that's where the controversy comes in, because the science is mixed. In some studies, they do seem to be heritable, but in other studies, they seem to be erased, and you start again with like a blank slate on the DNA. And then there's other studies that says for most genes, they get erased, but for some they do not. And like I alluded to, without going into a whole bunch of very complex molecular biology, there's other epigenetic mechanisms besides DNA methylation. Okay, just a real quick example. There's these little pieces of RNA that can also regulate genes epigenetically. And those can be inherited because sperm and egg are packed with those little RNAs, and they get passed on. So even if DNA methylation marks kind of get wiped clean, those little pieces of RNA are still in the gametes. And this is partly explaining why that, you're probably familiar with the studies I talked about in the book. Men who eat a lot of junk food, or men who do cocaine or other hard drugs, when they have a child, particularly a daughter for some reason, that daughter seems to be highly prone to breast cancer, much more than the average population. And there's no family history on the mother's side or the father's side. It came through these epigenetically inherited molecules that were in the dad's sperm because he had this unhealthy lifestyle. So we're starting to see these sorts of experiments. We can see the correlations coming out, and now we're trying to attach a mechanism to it. But at the end of the day, what this is telling us is that, usually when there's an issue with a baby, the mom gets the blame. That should not be the case. There's things going on in the father that could affect the quality of that sperm, which could affect the welfare of that child. And this is changing the paradigm of people who are thinking about having children, and how you really need to start implementing a healthy lifestyle, both for mom and dad, which would be also shooting off alarm bells in everybody, because you came into this world preloaded based on behaviors that your mom and dad did, things that you had no control over. And yet when people have issues, we're very quick to blame them. and their character, right? And it
Oh,
could have been the
sorry,
behavior
Dave.
of the mom and dad that kind of epigenetically programmed them to be at a disadvantage in a certain aspect of life. So we got to be really, you know, I don't enjoy or advocate putting blame on people anymore. Let's just figure out what happened, and get this knowledge. What the science is basically telling us, to wrap the story up real quick, is that at the end of the day, both mom and dad have to start living more healthier lives to give their baby the best chance in the world.
Yes.
Can you
Now,
say? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Anthony.
no, I was going to do the same thing, but I was going to talk about there's a really famous murderer who ended up defeating the criminal justice system just based off of that. I think it was like the first time it ever happened. So I think it's a really interesting. I think it's a very interesting story that I wanted to share with people. So there was, and correct me if I'm wrong, Professor. I think you talked about it's the MAO-A, right? To where that's called the warrior gene, and with that, it creates violent behavior and it creates intermittent rage disorder. Now, this guy, because of his epigenetics or because of the developmental phase, he ended up, I guess, getting some genetic testing. And with that testing, it showed that he had a lack of it. Now the reason that's important to understand is that MAO-A, it actually breaks down neurotransmitters. Now, when it breaks down those neurotransmitters, or when you don't have it, doesn't break it down, that's what creates all that extra aggression and that rage and so on and so forth. But because they were able to prove that he lacked it and it was something that he couldn't control, he actually got off the case of murder. Really fascinating.
Yeah, you're referring to the case of Bradley Waldrop. This
Yes.
happened in 2009.
Yeah.
He was the first person in history to be spared the death penalty. He still got imprisoned for life for murder, but he was spared the death penalty for murder.
Death penalty. That's what it was. Yes.
Because of his
Sorry.
genetic makeup. And you're right, it was
Mhm.
MAOA, which is a gene that encodes an enzyme that breaks down neurotransmitters in the brain. And it's been well established that if you make this, he has a genetic mutation in this gene, okay? And if you make that same mutation in mice, you see the same thing. You see this toxic buildup of neurotransmitters in the brain that basically put the mouse into this hyper aggressive mode. And these mice who have that mutation that Bradley Waldrop and some others in the environment have do become more aggressive and violent. It's really a phenomenon to see. But there's more to it than that. And what science, science jumped all over this when it came out. The MAOA got a lot of press back in the day for being the so-called warrior gene, which makes geneticists really angry. Because
Sorry if I offended.
oh no, you're doing what's out, it's been written up that way. And I refer to it in the book so that people gain clarity that, yeah, this is the so-called warrior gene, but the plot thickens, and it's never all that simple. So Bradley Waldrop had other issues besides this genetic mutation, and this gets back into the epigenetics that both of you raised and how important the environment is. Because now that this case happened and we see these studies in mice where we make that mutation, and yeah, these mice do get more aggressive. It's pretty remarkable. It's pretty striking to see. And it raises this question, like, are all violent and aggressive people, is it something that they can't help? Is this just kind of hardwired into their genetic makeup? Are we stuck with being violent for the rest of our lives? Really important questions. So a lot of research has gone into this. And what scientists have found at the end of the day is that this same genetic mutation in the MAOA gene happens in people who wouldn't hurt a fly. Okay, so this kind of introduces a big question into the whole genetic determinism, that there's an environmental component to all of this too. It's just not that simple. And we can't like screen people for this genetic mutation and guarantee that they're going to be violent. Violence and aggression are too complex of behaviors. Genes don't encode for a warrior phenotype. They don't encode for obesity. They don't encode for drug addiction. They encode for a protein. and that's all they do. Okay. That protein works with tens of thousands of other proteins in the cell to bring about a certain personality or behavior. So we can't just look at one gene or one mutation and leap to conclusions. That rarely works, rarely benefits anyone. So to sum up this story, the mystery that unfolded was the environment. This warrior-like behavior emerges when you have both the mutation and adverse childhood experiences, or so ACEs, as it's known in the field. And Bradley Waldrop had, in fact, just that. He was abused when he was a child, and it is thought that that unique combination is what gave rise to his violent behavior. Studies of prisoners do find that violent offenders are enriched for this particular genetic mutation in MAOA. But when they reanalyzed the data, they also had ACEs. They also had adverse childhood experiences. Those who come up in better childhood environments where they didn't have abuse or bullying, and they had this mutation, they didn't have a predisposition for anger and aggression. They were fine. So it underscores the fact that the environment and genes collaborate, two sides of the same coin. And it goes back to some of what Christine said earlier. How do we benefit from this knowledge moving forward? We can't control what sort of genetic mutations we inherit, but we do have a good degree of control over our environment. Okay, so we can construct healthy environments to work with the certain genetic blueprint that we're stuck with. Okay, we can't change that, but we can change our environments. And that gives us a great deal of flexibility and freedom on how we can move forward in a healthy manner with individuals who may, come preloaded with genes that might present a problem.
I think you also
at the end of the day, we should not have children subjected to ACEs. So let's maybe put aside some federal money to take better care of our children.
Yeah,
that would seem to be an easy sell, but we really don't invest in our children as well as some other developed countries do. It's staggering.
Or the mothers during pregnancy too.
Yeah,
right?
There were. I think I alluded to one of the studies towards the end of the book, how a very inexpensive and simple intervention program teaching, I think they were single young moms, and teaching them about motherhood, prenatal care, and infant care. This happened over the course of years, and the outcomes were just astronomically good. There was no question the cost-benefit ratio of this program. The benefits far exceeded the costs. And for some reason, Washington is really resistant to helping mothers or parents in any way. It's dumbfounding to me.
Yeah, or any just preventative care, right?
You want to make a strong, healthy country, it starts with investing in your own citizens.
I also remember, you're talking about the warrior gene. You were talking about with depression and how I think it was in Japan or something, like they had one of the genes that people had hypothesized was connected to depression, but in some Asian cultures, depression isn't expressed as much, even though they have the gene.
That's right. And that's another fascinating topic, the difference between Western behaviors, where we grow up in this hyper-competitive, capitalistic, individualistic culture, where in some cultures of the world, particularly the Asian countries, it's more of a collectivism culture. And you're brought up not to be individualistic and egotistical. You're basically brought up to help the community, okay? And the ego, the self, is diminished. It's basically the Buddhism philosophy, if you're familiar with that. It's the diminishment of the self, but the enrichment of the community, which is a really lovely philosophy, because if you live in a healthy community, it only benefits the individuals as well, okay? But there's some really fascinating studies that have been done in the health and welfare of people raised in Western countries versus these collectivism countries. And Christine, you're exactly right. There's a very famous study where, you know, there's dozens and dozens of genes that have been linked to depression. So if we look at someone who's predisposed to depression in a Western country, who's genetically predisposed, they have higher odds of actually getting depression than someone who has that same genetic mutation in a collectivism culture. They usually don't get depressed because they have all this support from their community.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And I think that goes into in the book you start talking about the evolutionary ghost. I believe that's what it is. I think that's what it sounds like. I mean, people have one perspective and they're more along the lines or inclined to help people that have that same perception rather than the opposite, and then so on and so forth. I mean, you see that in the dog community all the time. It's like, hey, you got a rescue dog? Me too. Cool. I want to help you. Or, oh, you're with a breeder? No, you're horrible. Or, I got a big dog. I got a small dog. I like pit bulls. Pit bulls are horrible. So I think it just goes back to where it's at, that evolutionary ghosting that you were talking about, to where people just have different beliefs. And then whenever they have different beliefs, their brain, I mean, just subconsciously just automatically goes towards that. Like you said, it maybe just to conserve energy or something that they're not really thinking of. But I don't know. That's exactly what it sounds like.
I use evolutionary ghosts in a number of different contexts. I don't know why I was drawn to that phrase. It just sounded really cool. And again, because there are aspects about human personality and behavior that we don't have any control over. We are products of evolution, and it's been going on for eons now. A lot of our characteristics can be seen in chimpanzees or bonobos, which are our closest cousins on the evolutionary tree, which tells us that we've been evolving certain behaviors for a very, very long time now. So they're deeply entrenched within us. Mm-hmm. They're part of human nature. So I say that we're haunted by these evolutionary ghosts because, again, we're kind of born preloaded with certain, certain quirks, okay, that I would call them certain psychological quirks that the brain does. And I would be happy to talk about some of those because they do create some of our most pressing problems in the world today, like political polarization, stereotyping, racism, and so on. Mm-hmm. These are all the result of these evolutionary ghosts that I talk about that kind of haunt our brain and put reasoning in the shadows, if you will, because our brain has a remarkable capacity to be analytical. But these evolutionary ghosts kind of push that to the side and take over in some people to our community's detriment. So we can certainly talk about that. But to be fair to you, Anthony, I wanted to circle back real quick to the epigenetics discussion. And Christine brought this up too, this inherited trauma sort of phenomenon. Yeah. So if you don't mind, I'd like to describe the experiment, the classic experiment that showed evidence of what we call transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. That's quite a mouthful, but the study is really fascinating. So it all starts with these investigators who were looking at mice, and mice, just like humans, they love the smell of almonds, okay? Mm-hmm. So there's a chemical that smells like almonds that these investigators used. And when you expose mice to this chemical, they get all happy, they are attracted to it. So then the investigators decided that once they exposed these mice to this almond scented chemical, they would deliver a mild shock to the mouse, okay? And this quickly became a learned behavior that when I smell almonds, I'm going to get shocked. So I'm going to run away from that smell. I'm going to be afraid of it. So basically what these scientists did was they instilled a new instinct into these mice and made them unnaturally afraid of the smell of almonds. That's not too surprising. What is surprising is that when they mated these mice, the children were born afraid of the almond scent, which is remarkable because they've never got shocked. They've never seen their parents get shocked. It was like this behavior that their parents learned was suddenly inherited by the children. And then the grandchildren still preserved this behavior. The grandchildren of those mice were still afraid of the smell of almonds. Now, this behavior does eventually go away. It gets diluted out over the generations, but it was really unexpected to see a learned behavior get imprinted upon the progeny of those mice. It would be something like, I learned to play the piano. Why isn't my son born, knowing how to play the piano? That's kind of like what this is implying, right? These mice learn to become afraid of the smell of almonds, and their children are born afraid of that smell. How in the world does that work? It's obviously not a genetic mutation, okay? Genetic mutations just don't work that way. So people look to epigenetic explanations, and that's exactly what seems to be going on. And this is one of the few experiments that really compellingly suggests that some epigenetic modifications are heritable. And it raises the question, well, if we can see this in mice, and it's a pretty reproducible experiment, is there any evidence for it in humans? Great question. We can't put humans and human babies into a room and start doing these sorts of experiments. It's quite unethical. But we can look at historical records. And the most famous classical experiment cited in this type of study is the World War II famine that took place in the Netherlands. There was a blockade during World War II that starved a lot of individuals in Northern Europe. And during that time, people were pregnant and still having babies. So investigators looked at historical records, and it turns out that the mothers who were pregnant during that famine, as you alluded to, Anthony, when you're in the uterus, when a baby is in utero, it is basically being epigenetically programmed for the environment that it's going to be born into. So these unborn babies were basically being epigenetically programmed to be born into a famine. And what does that mean? Well, it basically means their genes were tweaked to extract the maximum amount of calories out of a very low amount of food. Okay? That's exactly the kind of metabolic state you want to be in if you're born into a famine where there's not a lot of food. But of course, World War II ended, the famine's over, and now we live in a very calorie-rich world, okay? And it turns out that the children and even the grandchildren of these mothers who were starved during this famine now suffer from obesity and diabetes because their epigenome had been tweaked to extract the maximum amount of calories. And you put that type of individual into a high calorie world, it's an obvious recipe for obesity because they're ingesting high calorie foods right off the bat, but their bodies are engineered to extract the maximum amount of calories out of them. And that's usually pointed to as evidence for human transgenerational epigenetic inheritance.
So it's so helpful for so helpful for people who are hyper vigilant and just have like such a I don't know, over aroused sympathetic nervous system, right? To look at maybe even though you didn't go through a trauma, but looking at your parent and understanding how their trauma affected you.
Exactly. Now, and who would have thought to do that? I mean, it's such a counterintuitive thing that you have to back up a number of generations to maybe see what was going on to explain or possibly explain one of the personality or behavioral traits you have today.
Well, I think therapists, of course, go that to the parents, but not so much looking at the grandparent.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's a good. I mean, I was literally going to get into that sooner or later, but I didn't think about it that way. So if you're talking about, just with epigenetics, if something traumatic were to happen, right, to where they're more predisposition to be aware of their surroundings, or they're more predisposition to sense danger, and obviously with that comes anxiety. With that comes, possibly even like schizophrenia, arguably, with that, are they automatically predispositioned to lack GABA?
Oh, well, yeah, schizophrenia is a hugely complex neurological condition, and we don't quite know what's going on there. There seem to be multiple different components related to it. First one is genetic. So there are a handful of genes that have been correlated with schizophrenia, but there's no smoking gun. There's environmental components, and there's even an infectious component. So some viruses and the protozoan parasite Toxoplasma gondii, which my lab works on, has been strongly correlated with predisposing individuals to schizophrenia. In fact, infection with the Toxoplasma parasite has a stronger correlation with schizophrenia than any of the genes that have been implicated in the disease.
Wow. And anxiety?
Just, for schizophrenia.
Wow.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about the toxoplasmosis? Just about its impact on mood and what your lab has found.
Real quick.
Yeah, go ahead, Anthony.
No, definitely. I definitely want to hit toxoplasma, but about that GABA question, if that was the situation, would they naturally be predispositioned to not produce as much GABA?
The experiments that I talked about in the book that relate to GABA have to do with drug and alcohol addiction. So GABA is a neurotransmitter that works in the brain, and it basically calms the brain down. It's what we call an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And what we find in individuals who are more prone to drug and alcohol addiction is that they have a hyperactive brain, which relates to genetic variations in their GABA neurotransmitter system. So GABA is not working properly. They have a hyperactive brain, and that hyperactive brain drives some people to alcohol because alcohol, the chemical structure of alcohol looks a lot like the GABA molecule and functions kind of in the same way to sedate the brain, to calm the brain down. So alcohol in many ways kind of replaces that deficiency for GABA in these individuals. The problem is alcohol is extremely addictive, and you need more and more of it as time goes by to achieve the same effect. So it's a really bad way to self-medicate, if you will, if you have a GABA deficiency. Other people, these GABA deficiencies in the hyperactive brain turn into ADHD or a loss of impulse control, things of that sort.
Yeah, I know you mentioned so many of the genetic things that are with addiction that are similar in ADHD. It's so interesting looking. It makes sense that there's a high comorbidity with those two.
Yeah, it does. And it all goes back to that seemingly single neurotransmitter pathway. As research goes on, I'm sure it's going to get more complex. But what stands out most obviously right now, and this was actually some work done at our institute at the IU School of Medicine, where we basically sequenced a whole bunch of genomes from individuals who suffered from alcoholism and then individuals who don't. Alcoholism is what most people don't realize is that it doesn't happen a lot. Given the number of people who imbibe, who ingest alcohol in their lives, which is probably just about everybody at some point, only about 10% of people go on to become alcoholics. So that's a fascinating biological question. What's the difference between these individuals? And by sequencing all of their genomes, what the investigators have found is that there's deficiencies in the GABA system in most of the people who suffer from alcoholism. Goes to the issue that Christine raised is, there's a genetic proclivity towards some of these conditions like ADHD or, impulse control, anxiety issues, or alcoholism.
Mm-hmm. And then the cultural component too, right?
I was just going to add that part to it. You got in before I did, for that. Because those individuals gravitate towards certain activities based on their environment. So if they grow up in an environment where they either don't have access to alcohol or it's strongly forbidden for whatever reason, or they're just not exposed to it, they're much less likely, obviously, to become an alcoholic despite their genetic variations that predispose them in that regard.
Yeah, or with overseas, the drinking age being lower too, and like the way that they're exposed to alcohol is not the same way that Americans are with alcohol, as far as getting drunk and overly consuming. It's, we have a glass of wine at dinner, and so just culturally, their understanding of alcohol is different.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Mhm.
Wow. All right. So I would love to hear about toxoplasmosis. So I'm sorry to cut off like that.
Oh yeah,
No.
no problem. So toxoplasma is a parasitic infection that we should definitely talk about, because most people are infected with it and they don't even know it. So toxoplasma is a single-celled parasite that has infected up to 1/3 of the world's population. So we're talking billions of people. They carry this parasite in their brain and they don't even know it. So that sounds like the premise of a good science fiction movie right there, but it's real, okay? And why has hardly anyone heard of this parasite? And that's because it really doesn't make you sick. It's very sneaky, and it has multiple routes of transmission, which means it can get into a human being through many different ways. One of the primary ways is through the cat. Unfortunately, the cat is the definitive host of this parasite, which means the cat is the only organism on the planet where the parasite undergoes the sexual stage of its life cycle. So the cat is basically going to excrete infectious parasitic particles into the litter box or the sandbox or the yard, wherever the cat goes to the bathroom. When the cat's infected, you have a high chance of acquiring that infection yourself. Now, toxoplasma gets into all animals, not just cats, not just humans. It gets into all vertebrate animals, many of which we put on our dinner plate. And if we don't cook the meat sufficiently, we could also get toxoplasma infection that way, because the parasitic cysts are embedded in the muscle tissue of these animals. And then there's a chance of congenital transmission, which is more rare. But that happens when a woman pregnant becomes infected for the first time during the pregnancy. The parasite can actually cross the placental barrier and either cause abortion or catastrophic birth defects in the fetus. They tend to be born with encephalitis or blindness or suffer cognitive defects during the course of their development, because the parasite did neurological damage while that individual was still in the womb. So lots of different ways the parasite can get around explains why so many people are infected. But outside of the congenital infection that I talked about, if you're a normal, healthy adult and you get the parasite, you won't even feel sick. Your immune system will control this parasite quite readily, but unfortunately, the immune system does not get rid of it. The parasite employs a very clever trick where, when it senses the immune system, it stops growing and develops into a tissue cyst. And these are primarily found in the brain, sometimes in the heart and skeletal muscle as well. But what that means at the end of the day is that if you were infected with toxoplasma at any point in your life, you now have hundreds, maybe thousands of these cysts in your brain tissue doing God knows what. And that brings us to Christine's inquiry about, is there an effect on personality and behavior because of this parasite? Well, let's go back to mouse models. Mice emulate infection very well, okay, because there's a really interesting evolutionary link here. When a mouse becomes infected with toxoplasma, it reacts just like humans. It might show a little bit of illness at day 7 or 8, but it gets better. And when you look at it later on, seems perfectly healthy. It's happy and it's running around, eating fine, no loss of weight. But they're not normal anymore. This parasite has done something to their brain that makes them hypermodal. So they tend to move around a lot more than uninfected mice. They're more anxious and they take more risks. You expose them to stimuli that most mice are afraid of, but these infected mice have no fear. They're not afraid of these things anymore. And one of the more remarkable, striking findings is they're not even afraid of cats.
That's right.
Okay.
Oh, that's right. Yes, I remember that you talked about that in your book.
So talk about a good premise for a science fiction movie. Remember, cats are the definitive host. The cats are where the parasite has sex. It's the organism it really wants to be in. It doesn't want to be in a mouse or a human. It wants to be in a cat. So if you're stuck in a mouse, what do? Well, you're in the brain. Maybe you can find a way to tweak that brain to be more readily eaten by the cat. And that's exactly what Toxoplasma has done over the course of evolution. It has somehow modified the rodent brain to make itself more prone to be eaten by a cat. And that's the way Toxoplasma gets back into the creature that it really wants to be in. And
now,
yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead. You're probably gonna beat me to it.
Well, I was just going to add, it raises the question,
Yeah.
if you can do that to a mouse and billions of people are infected, what is this parasite doing to people? Fascinating question. And we're just beginning to look at it.
The things that horror movies are made.
Exactly.
Now,
this
for
is
all my
begging
canine
for
go ahead.
you know, a theatrical release of some kind.
Yeah, and to make it even more interesting for all my canine people out there that are listening, and Professor Sullivan actually did an article for Yahoo News about this. So there's this really big thing going on right now. I think it was in Yellowstone Park, correct?
That's right.
To where wolves are actually shown to be infected by that. Now, the crazy thing about that is going back to the risk-taking behavior and all that. It's nine times out of 10 are a very high possibility whatever wolf is infected by that becomes leader of the pack. Now, whenever they become leader of the pack, they're the ones that are mostly responsible for reproduction, but essentially leading the pack to wherever he chooses or she chooses, right? Now, what's going on in Yellowstone Park is these wolves are actually invading panther dens. Now, the cool thing about that is now you have a wolf that is a lot more capable than a mouse. And you would never see that in the past. A wolf actually go there. They're usually pack animals and staying away from that, hunting in packs and stuff. But now they're actually hunting these panthers. So it goes back to where that question is, to where it's like, it's so crazy. Number one, how do wolves get it if they're really not around that area? And number two, when they do get it, now you have a more capable animal going to this panthers. And in my mind, I'm just like, it can't really be good for either or. Now you have an aggressive wolf that could potentially take out a panther den, but at the same time, that's probably the parasite's way of being like, hey, I'm bringing you food so I can reproduce in your gut or wherever. It's really fascinating.
That is fascinating. And a similar study, that wolf study is pretty new. And if memory serves correct, infected wolves were like 21 times more likely to be the leader of the pack. Which goes towards this common theme that animals infected with Toxoplasma seem to take more risks. And that kind of predisposes them to maybe a feline predator. A very similar study was done out in the field with, I think it was hyena cubs. Hyena cubs that were infected with Toxoplasma were also much more prone to being eaten by a cheetah.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. But studies like the wolf study and the hyena study are pretty rare because they're very difficult to do and they take quite a bit of time. But I'm really happy to see them coming out. And even though they're kind of confirming what laboratory studies have shown, it's always gratifying and important to validate those laboratory studies out in the field and to see them actually playing out in wildlife. But it all makes...
Is it more attraction based? Like, I understand the whole risk taking behavior, but is it more attraction towards the cats or aggression towards the cats? Or are they submissive whenever they approach the cats? How does that work?
That's a good question. And that was the leading line of thought early on. In fact, there was one famous paper that came out that said, not only are they unafraid of cats, they're actually attracted to them, maybe through the odor. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore, though. Additional experiments have come out that suggest that they are just general risk takers and they're unafraid of all stimuli, okay, not just cat-related stimuli. They're unafraid of everything. So
Wow.
it seems to be a more generalized response. So I guess the last piece of information, which might be on the minds of a lot of people, is what is going on in humans. And we see some of the same characteristics that we see in rodents, in the wolves, in the hyenas. So in humans infected with chronic infection, and these are correlation studies, not causation, just correlation. So you got to take them with a grain of salt. Humans infected with toxoplasma also seem to engage in higher risk-taking activities. There's been links to toxoplasma infection and gambling, for example. There are links between being infected with toxoplasma and being involved in a car accident. You're 3 times more likely to be a reckless driver if you have toxoplasma infection. The strongest link that I might have alluded to earlier is with schizophrenia. So my lab and some others have shown that this chronic infection with these toxoplasma cysts in your brain actually induce a low level of neuroinflammation. So they cause inflammation in the brain. And that's been previously linked to predisposing people to schizophrenia. And it might answer a lot of the questions. Schizophrenia might not be caused by one thing, okay? There are certain genes that you can inherit that cause inflammation in the brain. There are other infections that cause inflammation in the brain. And there's environmental toxins that can cause inflammation in the brain. So maybe if you get a perfect storm of some of these things, that's what ultimately sets schizophrenia off. So that's, oh, and I think Christine mentioned this already too. Rage disorder is also associated with toxoplasma infection, which is kind of similar to risk-taking and loss of impulse control. So pretty fascinating parasite. And my lab's been working very hard to try to identify new therapeutics that can get these cysts out of the brain. And the main reason for that is the clinical component, because even though most healthy people, these cysts really don't do anything that we can see clinically, if you were to become immunocompromised, either through HIV or maybe sometimes during cancer chemotherapy or organ transplantation, toxoplasma can reactivate and the parasites start growing again very rapidly, and they are eating up brain tissue as they do that. So you can have a very disquieting neurological effect if toxoplasma becomes reactivated during immune compromisation. So there's a real clinical need to get rid of these cysts before something like that happens, because reactivation of infection can be life-threatening for immunosuppressed populations. So we've been working very hard to try to identify drugs that can get rid of these cysts. But let's say we're successful in doing that, and then we treat someone with toxoplasmosis, all the cysts in their brain are cleared. Would we fundamentally change their behavior? You know, yeah. And would we take away maybe a personality trait or a behavior that they're known for, and basically make them unrecognizable to other people? That's a philosophical component to our work that we now have to consider, given these behavioral studies that are coming out. And, you know, it's a pretty interesting question to ponder. And when you think about how much free will you might have and how much, you know, either a pathogen or genes or epigenetics or evolution really pulling the strings on the puppet, if you will. So yeah, that's a pretty fascinating aspect to our work that, you know, is kind of on our minds as we move forward.
So
I can see that
with my clients who have a lot of health anxiety. So I'm sure they're gonna be like, how do I get tested for this? How do I know if I'm infected? And then if I have a parasite, what do I do? I think there must have been something going on around TikTok, because I had one client who was like, maybe it's parasites in the brain. I need to get hydrochloroquine to get rid of parasites, you know? So I don't know if you could speak on like that.
Yeah, no, that comes up a lot. And usually whenever there's a big splash of toxoplasma in the news, like that wolf story not long ago, we see a spike in these sorts of questions. And I get emails constantly from people thinking that toxoplasma is going to explain all of their problems. And I rush to tell them probably not. But, just for accuracy's sake, yeah, there's a simple blood test you can take to see if you're toxoplasma positive. And in fact, in countries where toxoplasma is even more widespread, they test pregnant women routinely for toxoplasma infection. We don't do that here. And we probably should. 1 out of 4 people getting infected with the organism, about 4,000 cases of congenitally infected infants every year. Why aren't we testing women for this parasite? I don't quite understand it. I guess it relates to money. But it's a useful test because if it shows up positive, you can begin a drug treatment that will minimize damage to the fetus. And the earlier you start that treatment, the better off the fetus will be. But I guess that's a tangent. So there is a blood test available, Christine. But just because you test positive, I'd be very hesitant to draw any conclusions that relates to anything concrete in someone's personality or behavior, given all the other more likely explanations that are out there. Because let's face it, about 3 billion people carry this parasite in their brains, and hardly anyone has heard about it because it's probably not doing anything greatly impactful, when we consider all the other things going on that could affect personality and behavior. Could it be involved? Well, the studies are just correlational, as I said. So we need more studies like that wolf study and the hyena study, where we go out into the real world and demonstrate these correlations, with much greater certainty. Then we might have something that, is more reliable, and we can build confidence from there. And there's no cure for it. So if these people get tested, they're just going to get knowledge. You can't take hydrochloroquine or ivermectin or anything and get rid of toxoplasma from your body. There is a drug that will control the growing stage of the parasite. It's called Daraprim, right? So that's a drug that only puts toxoplasma into remission. It won't cure the disease, but it could, save your life if you have an acute episode. So that's what immune compromised patients take. But it's not a cure. So individuals who want to take medicine of some kind, Christine, that's not advised.
Yeah, I think there was just so much misinformation.
Absolutely.
Not
enough studies. Now, I know we only have you for a couple more minutes. First, thank you so much for staying with us this long. I feel like we could talk about this all day. When it comes to genetic testing, how can people, or where can people go to get genetic testing to see what they're more predisposition to, or to see their microbiome or anything like that? Where can they go for that?
Excellent questions. There's a variety of commercial genetic companies that will test either some key genes, okay, or just the whole genome, okay? And they vary in cost and exactly what they do and what they tell you. So what we have to keep in mind about these genetic testing, some of them are useful, okay? So if you want, I'm not trying to discourage anyone from checking it out. I did it myself just out of curiosity. Some of it was crazy accurate, okay? They told things, they didn't tell me anything new about myself, but I was pretty surprised at some of the predictions they made that are actually true, okay? I'm a super taster, for example, and my genetic tests confirm that. Super tasters have an aversion to vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower because of some of the bitter chemicals. I can't stand those vegetables because they just taste excessively bitter to me. So I'm what scientists call a super taster, and there's a specific genetic mutation that alters your taste buds that makes you more sensitive to these bitter chemicals. So I got tested and confirmed that, yeah, I'm a super taster, but that's nothing my tongue couldn't have told me previously, right? But it's kind of nice to have that, I can show my parents, this is why I didn't eat broccoli as a kid. I have this gene mutation. It's not my fault. So
where'd you go to get tested?
So yeah, that's one thing that was kind of cool, in a kind of neat sort of way. And some of these genetic testings will tell you if you're predisposed to like Alzheimer's or breast cancer or things like that. And some of those can be accurate. I wouldn't look at those results without consulting with a genetic counselor or a physician, because, there are other genes that play into disease. It's rare that a disease is caused by one gene. It does happen, of course. There's some cancers that are one gene is responsible for it, or sickle cell anemia. One gene is responsible for that. Huntington's disease, same way. So there's a handful of diseases that are linked to just one gene or one genetic mutation. But the vast majority of diseases and all behaviors and personality traits involve thousands of different genes. So no genetic test is going to accurately tell you that you're an extrovert, okay, or that you're more conscientious, or you're going to be predisposed to violent behavior. Genetic tests really don't offer that kind of resolution. And as we mentioned earlier, there's this environmental component that we're finding we simply cannot underestimate.
And it's not 100% too, because like I know, like my parents have gotten, the like 23andMe genetic test, and like you said, some things are like, yeah, I totally know, caffeine affects me, all these things. But then like there was something about like we all sneeze at the sun, like, multiple sneezes. And it's so funny. And my father, my son, and myself all walked out from a restaurant into the sun. All three of us started sneezing multiple times. But like, I think that's one of the genetic things that they test, and it said that he didn't have it. And it's like, well, we know he does have it.
Right.
And I, in the material from the company, it's like genetics doesn't explain everything, and that you have to look at the environment for that too.
So that's that testing, the 23andMe and companies like that. That's that genetic testing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I know some psychiatrists also have clients do that to help determine medication and what medication, that they might have more side effects, what medication might be more therapeutic. So I know some psychiatrists do it, but not all.
That's a good point. I didn't touch on that. Some of those tests do look at liver enzymes,
Wow.
which are encoded genetically, obviously. And some people have variations in those liver enzymes that make them process certain drugs differently. And that could be the explanation that why certain healthcare professionals look at those tests, because it can be informative as a guide to whether a person's going to respond to a certain drug or whether they might have an increased proclivity for side effects.
Yeah,
So,
it's especially helpful for people who've tried so many different things and things didn't work or had negative side effects. And
yeah, so they clearly have some utility. But people do need to understand that when you're talking about complex personality traits and behaviors, the genetic testing is not going to be very helpful.
Well, and medication won't fix everything either, right?
That's
exactly what. Mm-hmm.
Good. Well, the last question I have, I know I've had a lot, and I apologize to both of you guys. I'm so excited about this. So I wrote it down, and like I told you before this, Professor. I mean, as a candidate behaviorist, I read about all this stuff with the microbiome and about just the different tests that you went over with the mice. And it really seems like that's kind of the new thing that's going to be happening, or that's kind of on the rise, right? So with that being said, I mean, how close are we to that as far as, for it to actually start being prescribed? And like we talked about, if so, how ethical is that?
Right. So I think in the last chapter of the book, this is where I tried to synthesize all the material that we talked about, much of which we touched upon today, and build a path forward. And any path forward that involves medical interventions of some kind, there's going to be some element of risk, some element of uncertainty. And this gets into some of the ethical issues that you might be wondering about. All advancements are going to be accompanied with those, because technological advancements always have a beneficial side, but you can always imagine a dark side to them as well. And then there's the unforeseen consequences which can emerge too. Paul Offit just wrote a wonderful book called You Bet Your Life that talks about new medical interventions and how we're going into uncharted waters, and we just have to stay vigilant for how they're going to work. So the key things we talked about today that are described in the book that involve genetics, involve epigenetics, which is how the environment regulates those genes, And then there's the microbiome component, okay, which talks about the intestinal bacteria and how they can affect our personality and behavior. And then there's these evolutionary ghosts that we talked about, as well as some psychological brain works that we alluded to as well. So you put all this at the end of the day, and you realize that the equation for personality and behavior is complex, and it involves many different variables that we've talked about today. There's rarely any one size fits all when we're talking about personality and behavior, especially when it comes to therapeutic treatments. And a lot more research needs to be done. Epigenetics and the microbiome are really hot areas of research, but who knows where that research is going to lead? Are these going to be the therapies of the future? I'm optimistic, and I think that they might be, but I'm not going to bet my house on it. You know what I mean?
Got it.
Yeah, time will tell. So that's where I think we are with some of these things, and they're very exciting to think about. Obviously, very thrilling to talk about. I enjoyed this conversation as much as hopefully you guys did. It's just wonderful stuff to talk about, and it's what gets me up out of bed every morning. I want to see what's happening in science and psychology and how we can move forward more productively, to benefit mankind.
And I think until those therapeutics are out there, like your message, I mean, for me, I feel like this is so much of what I do with my clients is understanding who you are, what made you who you are, right? And that can be, your own environment, your parents' environment, possibly grandparents' environment. And then once you understand that, like what parts are changeable that you might want to change, and then what parts are just who you are. And then when you understand who you are, how can you have the environment fit that?
Right.
So you function optimally and have a happy life.
I think I need to have Christine write the conclusion to my next book, because that is perfect. That's
beautiful.
That's exactly what I was going for, because I didn't just want to inform people about a bunch of cool science. I wanted to give them tangible, directions that they can take. There's a saying, I think it was Nietzsche, I'm not entirely sure, to embrace fate, embrace who you are, embrace the hand that you were dealt, work with that. You really don't have much choice, so you might as well embrace it, and then construct an environment that plays into that hand. And you can live a very happy, healthy, and productive life no matter what hand you're given, if you're able to remodel your environment accordingly. And the book gives you tangible lessons about that. And the take-home messages are better diet, more exercise, taking better care of your body, because that is what makes the mind thrive.
Wonderful.
Yay, Dr. Henry.
Well, yay, Bill Sullivan for, having this great work that people can read and easily digest and, give them that message, right? So it's one thing if I say it, but then if you have a scientist saying it with data, people listen to it.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for the book that you've written. And I hope that, I'm sure you're so busy with your own research, but it was so well written and so well received. I hope there's another book in your future.
I hope so too. But I can't thank you enough, especially if you're using it to discuss with your patients, and if that is helping them, that's just one of the most gratifying things I can experience, to know that those words are actually conferring a benefit on someone. That just makes my day, makes my year. And Anthony, thank you for providing this forum so that we can talk about it and get more people aware of some of the simple things that they can start doing to live a happier, healthier life.
Well, I can't take credit for that. That was Dr. Henry. So, I mean, it was just awesome. Yeah.
Well, I thank you both.
Yeah.
It's
been a true pleasure. Your questions have been fantastic. I loved the audience questions as well. They raised a lot of good points too.
Mhm.
Yes. So Bev asked if we can put up the book. So this is the book. It's called Pleased to Meet Me. Obviously, it's written by Professor Bill Sullivan. It's amazing. Like I said, what we just covered was not even close to what this book has. It's phenomenal. It tells you everything about yourself. And everyone, thank you so much for your engagement. Thank you, Bill, for your time. And yeah, do you have any more questions, Doctor?
Nope, I think we're good.
Great. Well, just stand by with us real quick after we end, Bill, if you can. And everybody, thank you so much. I really hope you enjoyed this. It was such a treat. And yeah, we'll catch you guys next time.
So let me just say one more thing, Anthony. If your listeners want, I've been writing some articles that kind of update some of the things in the book. So if people want to take a look at those, they can go to authorBillSullivan.com. Author Bill Sullivan's all one word. They can check out some of the other articles I've written. And if they want a signed copy of the book, there is a contact email that they can use on that website. Anyone is free to contact me through that. I can send them a signed copy of the book. I'll be pleased to do that.
Wonderful.
Awesome. Yeah, sorry I didn't ask about that. But no, that's awesome. That's awesome. I'll probably be sending you a book.
Yeah,
Well,
thanks so much for taking the time to, geek out with us today. And,
my pleasure.
We were so shocked when you wrote back and you said you'd come. We were just so amazed and so appreciative of your time.
Oh, it's been a thrill for me. I love talking about these sorts of things. So I'll be happy to come back sometime in the future if you so desire.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much. And again, Bill, just please stand by. And yeah, everybody, thank you for your interaction. And we hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks.
All right.